Hello and welcome to the latest seminar from the Glasgow Centre for Population Health, supporting new approaches to improve health and tackle inequality. In this videocast, Professor Sharon Friel looks at governing the commercial determinants of planetary health inequity. This seminar was recorded via Zoom on the 7th of December 2023.
I'm Bruce White, and I'd just like to welcome you to the third seminar in our 20th seminar series, and that on behalf of the Glasgow Centre for Population Health. So it's great to see so many people joining the call today. Just to explain a bit about today. Today we have Professor Sharon Friel from the Australian National University, and I'll introduce Sharon properly in a minute. But she's going to be talking to us about commercial determinants of planetary health inequity and the consumptogenic system that supports overproduction and overconsumption of goods and services. So some of these terms may seem slightly arcane and complex, but we have been aware of overconsumption for a long period. The concept of 3 or 5 planet living beyond the capacity of our planet have long been in public health parlance. And in Scotland, I think we're well aware of the impacts of alcohol, tobacco, and the food system on health and on health inequity in particular. And we're becoming more aware of other players, the gambling industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and the car industry. So I think this is a really important topic for us to focus on this morning from a planetary health point of view, but also from a health equity point of view. So before I introduce Sharon, I've got just a few things about the outline of how we're going to run the seminar. So Professor Friel will speak for about 40 minutes, followed by a brief response from a couple of panel members who I'll introduce later on. And then this will be followed by questions from yourselves in the audience. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom for any questions to Professor Friel and the panel. And please do keep these to questions rather than general comments. It may not be possible to get through all the questions, but we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. We're recording the seminar, and the presentation slides will also be available on the GCPH website in a couple of weeks' time. All attendees will be sent a link to this when it's available. If you're wanting to tweet during or after the webinar, please use the hashtag #GCPHSEM20. That's it, #GCPH, all in uppercase, S in uppercase, EM in lowercase, and then 20. So that's really the main kind of organization of the seminar, and I've just briefly introduced Sharon. So she's an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow and a Professor of Health Equity in the School of Regulation and Global Governance. She's also Director of the Planetary Health Equity Hothouse and Australian Research Centre for Health Equity at the Australian National University. Her work examines the political economy of health inequities with a focus on governance of the planetary, social and commercial determinants of health inequities. In her book in 2019, Climate Change and the People's Health, she focused on addressing the global consumptogenic system. So thank you very much for agreeing to speak, Sharon, and over to you. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks, Bruce, and yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. I'm in Australia, but as you can tell, I'm originally from Scotland, originally from Glasgow, and still think of it very much as home. So it's also sort of extra special to get the chance to talk with, I know many of you are in Scotland and in Glasgow, so thank you so much. Let me share some slides and just put them onto, yep. Please. There. So yes, so governing the commercial determinants of planetary health equity. First of all, what do I mean by planetary health equity or planetary health inequity? So the way we think about this in the hothouse is this intersection between climate change, inequality, and health. And if we are to, as many folk on this call will appreciate, addressing health inequities requires addressing the underlying social factors. And climate change intersects with those underlying social factors in ways that then go on to exacerbate health inequities. And so if planetary health equity is about the equitable enjoyment of good health in a stable Earth system, that's how we're defining it, then really doing something about the common drivers of climate change, of social inequities, will make a big impact on human health and health equity. And already climate change has locked in intergenerational inequities. Climate change has already exacerbated global economic inequities through pressures on productivity, on livelihoods. We see countries, particularly in low and middle income countries, already losing some of their economic growth as a consequence of climate change pressures. And then, of course, climate change has exacerbated existing health inequities. This is a picture from a part of Australia where flooding, incredible flooding, has taken place in 2022. And it was the most socially disadvantaged groups who were affected by that. Exactly the same thing happened in 2017. And I sort of say that because there was no lessons learned about addressing the underlying social inequities that existed, that previously existed, and that continued to exist within that community, in that society, in that time period. And so yet again, those populations were at increased risk from the pressures of, or the impacts of climate change, in this instance through floods. So when you put all of that together, climate change, intergenerational, economic inequities, social inequities that have all these historical and current drivers, what we will see and what we are seeing right now are exacerbations of the existing health inequities that exist within countries and between countries all around the world. And there are many things that can be done about this. I just want to close that. We can think about adaptation, and it's very important that we think about adaptation to existing climate change, and particularly the climate change and the emissions that are already in the atmosphere. There is a lot of discussion going on about the technical removal of emissions from the atmosphere. So we adapt to the existing emissions and we try and remove the greenhouse gas emissions that are already in the atmosphere. And that's really important. But I would say the sort of the similarity or the analogy in public health is that's already treating the symptoms, that's treating people when they are sick, or it's equivalent to the treating people when they are sick, all of which is vitally important, but it's not enough. And so we could think about the prevention of emissions going into the atmosphere. And that, again, similarities to how we think in public health of preventing people from getting sick in the first place. For many years, we've spoken about that as the social determinants of health and health inequities. And if we then connect it to climate change, it's about climate change mitigation. And I would argue that climate change mitigation is one of the biggest preventative health interventions that exists today. And so if we think that climate change mitigation and this relationship with health and health inequities is important, we have to do something about this consumptogenic system. And here I am not talking about actions that focus on consumers. We've seen that for so many years, it doesn't work. It's really about tackling the system that leads to hyper-consumerism. It's the system of institutions, of policies, of commercial activities, of social and institutional norms that fundamentally lock in, that incentivizes, that rewards the excessive production and consumption of fossil fuel goods and services that are, of course, they're fossil fuel goods and services, so they are inherently detrimental to the environment, but they're often very unhealthy, human pressures on health, and are very inequitably valued and distributed. So tackling this common system, this consumptogenic system, I would argue is vitally important if we want to do something about global health inequities. And so today I really just want to focus on the commercial activities, the commercial determinants of all of this and the governance questions around that. And how this commercial activities, commercial practices are really driving, creating and normalizing that hyper-consumerism that is often where the policy response or the practice response goes to. And as I say, I want us to really think about the system that's driving that. But it is this is a wonderful cartoon from Danny Dorling's book on the equality effect. We hear this messaging through marketing, but I want to speak about these other practices, the scientific, the political, supply chain, employment, financial and reputational practices from the commercial actors that are absolutely trying to keep business as usual. So let me just pick up on some aspects of these commercial entities and commercial practices. But before I do that, just a reminder that this is a problem in high-income countries and particularly in high-income groups in those high-income countries. The recent climate inequality report, which you can see one of the figures here, has highlighted that it's the within-country carbon inequality that now makes up the bulk of the global inequalities in emissions. So within countries. And you can see that much of that, or most of that, is among the top earners in the higher income countries, and this very strong social gradient in emissions. And so this, of course, COP28 is ongoing as we speak, and all of the loss and damages discussions, who pays, the emitter pays, the massive political question. But it's a problem for us in high-income countries to deal with that consumptogenic system that's driving these emissions and creating these inequalities. And before I go into the practices, I suppose I just want to pause and reflect on what has historically been the response. And this is drawing on some of the work, apologies, I haven't got the reference here, but some of the work from Catherine Trebeck, who spent a lot of time in Scotland. And Catherine's work talking about the economics of arrival in her book. And some three key elements of examining the response to date. So it's the sticking plasters, it's the servicing of the failure to do anything about these underlying common drivers, these structural problems of climate that create climate change inequality and poor health. And I think the cartoon from Australia, where I am, is very representative of missing the bigger picture, missing the bigger structural problem, and how we go to the individual having this, in this instance, the koala having the mental health problem, which is absolutely true after the fires here in Australia a few years ago, just before COVID. So we saw these fires whip through communities and ecosystems across Australia. And yet the response was about servicing these individuals and these, the koalas. We have a koala sanctuary, which is very important, but it's not doing anything about the fact that the fires are coming again. And why is that? So the response to date has been insufficient. And the response to date has locked in, the current response has locked in more fossil fuel production. So this is government policies that have locked us into, if nothing changes, locked us into at least 1.5 degrees warming and more. You can see we're on a 2 degrees trajectory very, very easy if things do not turn around very quickly. So if that's government policy, and this of course is in that very broad canvas way, why is that? Why is that the case? Why are we not seeing bold, courageous? Because so many of the levers, not exclusively, but so many of the levers to deal with these issues lie in the hands of the state. And why are we not seeing those bold responses? And I think that's a question of power inequities throughout our governance, our policy systems. And I know from the registration list for the seminar, many of you are in these systems grappling with these issues on a daily basis. And so I think it's really important that we identify and we name where these power plays, these power inequities are existing. We did a piece, if you're interested in reading a little bit more about it, the reference is there. And I think quite a simple way of coming at this question of power and power inequities is through the 3 I's: ideas, interests, and institutions. And once you see them, I find it so hard not to see them everywhere. So ideas, ideologies, paradigms that are sort of promulgated through framing, through discourse, through narratives, they tell interests what to mean. Is it an economic interest? Is it a health interest? Is it an equity interest? So how we talk about things, the types of dominant ideas and paradigms really shape those interests. And then institutions, the institution of the state, of government, of the market, helps, tells, supports these ideas, these paradigms, how to survive. And this is all about expressions of power using different forms of power that I'm going to unpack. Because this is the governance of policy and action. So coming back to the market and these commercial practices, so the institution, the rules and the norms of the market. We absolutely, certainly in Australia, in Scotland, in countries across the UK, across Europe, we live in liberal markets, dominant liberal markets. And so how do the market actors maintain their status quo and advance their strong economic and structural power? So let me just pick up on a number of the ways, the number of the rules and the norms that are pervasive through this institution that is the market. So science, for example, the practice by commercial entities of discrediting climate change, discrediting climate science. It's been around for years and years and years. And this really, I'm just showing you here on the screen how Exxon, previously Esso, so for those of us who remember Esso, but it's now Exxon, have funded for years, have funded front groups, conservative think tanks that are all about undermining the science to do with that relationship between greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, and some discovery of papers in the way that we saw with the tobacco industry papers, the same with some of these fossil fuel company papers that's been revealed over the years. And at the same time, what came to light was that actually a number of these companies were also, the scientists in these companies, these fossil fuel companies, had identified technologies that could have created much cleaner engines for cars. So hence why I've titled it Who Killed the Electric Car? We've known for decades and decades, and those companies have known for decades and decades that it's possible to have much cleaner vehicles through electric vehicles. But that would, of course, been a real issue for them at the time for profits, because they saw the profits were going up at the time from fossil fuel types of vehicles. So you've got this strange juxtaposition, I think, of the use of science, of technology, research and development on one hand, other forms of discrediting of science by these big corporations. And the rules of the game let them do that. They're not being held to account, they're not being penalised. You know, the patent technology is completely legal. The use of those patents absolutely very sensible. So the institutional rules are enabling this sort of behaviour. Similarly, with the reputational management or the corporate social responsibility, this is from Shell UK. This is from their Instagram, an analysis of their social media, and this is particularly from their Instagram feeds. And on their Instagram feeds, you can see, so that think about the discourse, the framing, the way they speak about them being part of the solution, they're powering progress, UK ready for cleaner energy. Those things are always used on their Instagram feeds. But the reality of it is this is a complete distraction. Shell, tiny investment in renewables and energy solutions, one of the highest spending on fossil fuel development and exploration pledged or invested over the coming years. And again, for those of you, if you're involved in alcohol, if you're involved in tobacco, if you're involved with the car industry or in planning, urban development, these are such similar practices. So this is greenwashing. Again, not held to account. Again, the rules, the social norms. This is absolutely expected of these companies. Political, corporate political activity is so pervasive. It's either done through lobbying, and I'll show that some countries around the world have registers. Not every country around the world has registers and disclosure requirements. If there were those rules, that would be a great thing, but it's certainly not sufficient. Of course, the way that corporations establish and use think tanks to provide evidence to shape policy and political agendas, we know that. And then that much more innocuous being part of the policy committees, sitting there in the policy development and implementation, particularly at the policy development stages, being supportive of and putting forward, of course, a particular sort of agenda, which really is about maintaining the status quo. And I show this picture. This is the Prime Minister of Australia. Recently in Australia, we had a referendum about giving a voice to Indigenous Australians into the machinations of government. We still, Indigenous peoples in Australia still do not have that. And so this was the Prime Minister going around the country trying to generate support for a yes vote. And look at his shirt. So his name is Anthony Albanese. So here's this lovely, friendly shirt that was given to him by Rio Tinto, one of the biggest fossil fuel companies in Australia and in the world. That wasn't a perchance thing that just happened. That was Rio Tinto very deliberately, that's very deliberate brand placement on a prime minister who's there campaigning about a very important social issue. So using these political activities is widespread and very much part of that institutional practice of the market. Supply chains. So I know in Scotland, oh gosh, I was about to say Scotland is part of Europe. I don't know how Scotland does trade anymore, but sort of trading rules, trading agreements between countries, between regional blocks is now much more in favour of large transnational corporations. It's so much easier now for companies to invest into countries enabled by legally binding trade agreements. So the trade and investment rules, which are of course our government policy, but that are very much set up to empower the market actors. This was some analysis that we did for Vietnam. Philippines is just there as a control country. All I really want you to look at is the uptick in the growth rate of sales of sugar sweetened beverages in Vietnam after Vietnam agreed to the rules to enter into the World Trade Organization, and that meant that they removed the restrictions for foreign investment into the country. And so of course companies like Coca-Cola and PepsiCo just see Vietnam as a massive marketplace for much greater investment and the growth of those products. We see that all over the world, of course. But things are changing in terms of the market and the economy. It's not really now, profits are not made now primarily through the movement of goods and services. It's very much in the 21st century, profits come from intellectual property and through financial instruments. And so banks and the financial arms of big companies are really important players in the global economy. And they use a whole load of, for anybody who has a pension fund, we're part of that system, this financialized system, which is all about the primacy of shareholders. And that might sound like a very glib thing to say, but what that does is it reshapes how companies operate. It reshapes the motivation of companies. It certainly has reshaped the motivation in markets. So the food price hike that happened in 2022, that countries around the world, including in Scotland and elsewhere across the UK, are absolutely feeling, partly because of the increase in price of wheat and maize. That was driven not through scarcity, not through availability. That was partly and quite significantly driven by speculation on the global stock exchange by investors, by these big money managers who invest in, trade in, bet on these financial instruments. In this instance, it's called a wheat investment fund. Massive investments at the start of 2022, because what they were seeing was this volatility in price as a consequence of Russia's invasion into Ukraine. So that really is speculation. That's not anything to do with investment in agriculture or investment in companies and the way that companies operate. It's pure speculation for the profits of the shareholders. And I would say that's gambling, and that's gambling on the risk of hunger. And when you think of climate change adding pressures onto already food scarcity or food insecurity, not food scarcity, on food insecurity, that's not a good thing for health. There's other ways that the financialization is affecting these institutional rules and norms. I've called it buy, squeeze and repeat. And so this is about mergers and acquisitions. 3G Capital, massive global investment firm. It started in Brazil, but it's now a massive global firm. It took over Heinz, HG Heinz, and of course got rid of a whole load of workers, closed factories. It was all about, of course, streamlining and increasing profits. It did the same with Kraft Foods. It merged Kraft Foods with Heinz, now one of the biggest food companies in the world, but the impact on labour conditions, on unemployment was the same. And then they've done the same massive investments into AB InBev, big alcohol, Burger King and Tim Hortons, which then got merged together to create Mondelez International, a huge, big conglomerate that really shapes the global food system. And so these investments and takeovers of companies, you might say, well, what on earth has that got to do with health and health inequities? Well, when it shapes the working conditions for people, which it absolutely does, we know that precarious employment and precarious employment conditions is sometimes even worse for our mental health than being unemployed. This was some analysis here in Australia of precarious working conditions, and I really just put that up to show you how depression was much higher and much worse when precarious employment, which comes as a consequence of things like mergers and acquisitions. So all of that really matters. And then finally, in the financialization of the economy, BlackRock, Vanguard and State Street, 3 big investors into major food companies. And so they get to vote in what these companies do, what products, the long-term investment in how these companies operate. So it really matters. They've got a vote in the AGM. The same companies have massive investments, about the same amount actually, in fossil fuels as they do in global agribusiness and food business. So if you think about addressing the consumptogenic system and the rules of the game through investment, financialization of the global economy, and these investors having a very significant say because they've got shares and the shareholders are the people who vote in the AGMs of companies, they get to decide what those companies do, how they treat their workers, what products, what practices. And BlackRock has been going around the world, Larry Fink has been going around the world saying, we're the good guys, we're going to divest, we're not going to invest in fossil fuels. But actually some investigative journalism has shown that they continue to invest and they continue to block, at the AGM, they continue to block any of that sort of progressive policy. So if we're concerned about planetary health equity, we've got to be thinking about these types of actors as well. Because remember the ideas, interests and institutions, what I've described to you are some of the institutional rules and norms that absolutely reinforce, embed and advance particular interests, and it's not the health equity interests that are advanced. And through their institutional and structural power, they maintain these dominant ideas and promulgate these dominant ideas of neoliberalism, of market supremacy, of profits, of financialization, and of individualism, because the sister of all of these other things is individualization. And so it's absolutely no surprise that in the policy or the dominant policy response that we see worldwide, when these market actors have such a stranglehold over the institutional rules and norms that we see this lifestyle drift in policy responses to, you'll eat more healthily, eat more environmentally sustainable foods. Here's a leaflet about how to do it. Don't forget to turn off the lights. Don't forget to drive an electric car. All individualized. So that. Yeah. So what can we do then to have an economy? And this really is building on the work of Kate Raworth and of Catherine Trebeck. How is it that how to position an economy that's in service of people and the planet, not the other way around? Yep. How, we have an economy, of course we have an economy, but how do we make it for purpose? And so that to me is a question about contemporary capitalism and what is the role of commerce in it. And we can have a discussion about should there be a role of commerce in it? Well, if you can tell me how we move forward in a way that completely decouples all of that'll be really interesting. But until we've got that, we have commerce as part of the actors. We have market actors in that governance triangle, and that triangle, that's a misrepresentation of suggesting that they're all equally powerful. We know that that's not the case. But how might we think about commerce in contemporary capitalism so that the economy and commerce serves people and the planet? Well, imagining and embedding a new paradigm, releasing and realizing state capacity. I call it taming the beast. What do those regenerative business and financial approaches look like? And then the strategic mobilization, the strategic acting by civil society groups. And this, I'm drawing here on the work from, you may have seen recently, there was a Lancet series on the commercial determinants of health. And what the third of the three papers was all about this question: what is the future of commercial actors in contemporary capitalism? They of course didn't call it that, but that is in essence. So let me just pick up what the state, the market, and civil society might do. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but some of the ideas. And really just the embedding, recognizing that there is right now a global policy landscape that is really supportive of acting on the commercial determinants of health, the commercial determinants of health equity, and the commercial determinants of planetary health equity. For example, in the World Health Organization, there's going to be a global report on the commercial determinants of health. WHO putting out a report on the commercial determinants of health is really phenomenal. I think they're going to take so much flack, there's going to be so much pushback, but it's so important that they are signaling that at the highest level of governance, the global authoritative organization, WHO for health, is saying we have to do something about the market. And then that, of course, is happening in different ways at national and subnational levels, and we'll hear from what's happening in Scotland. There's movement taking place. There's a whole reform taking place in international trade and investment treaties that offer, I think, some real promise. It'll be incremental change, but there's some change there. I won't go through the rest of this, but the macroeconomic policy innovations that we're seeing through things like the well-being economy, principles, budgets, frameworks offer some hope, I think. We'll see whether it's just tinkering at the edges and whether it really has any cut through and whether it actually pays attention to equity. That would be my critique. It's not doing it enough just yet. But what that would do, if you imagine if there is a push for a well-being economy, that starts to set a new political and policy norm in place. And that then has the possibility to start to recalibrate the drivers and the measures of success. It's no longer now about GDP. GDP might service that well-being economy, but it's not about that. So that's an important norm shift potential. So what about the market? We're seeing a whole load of alternative types of business models, the sustainable business models, the business cooperatives, the B Corps, as they're called. They're questionable, but they're an emerging alternative. So an examination of their possibilities, but also always saying, will they elevate people in the planet? Will they be in service of people in the planet? Ethical investment. I see that we're spending quite a lot of time talking with investors, and I'm certainly seeing quite a lot of interest, but quite a lot of questioning of how do we work this out? We just don't know how to do this. And then fundamentally, I do think we need bold, courageous government to stand up and say, you might be behaving to the corporates, you might be behaving legally, but it's really, really harmful. And what are the regulatory structures that need to be fit for purpose to be put in place that gets us to a place of healthy practices and products? And this is where I think civil society can be incredibly helpful. We've done an analysis of civil society groups in Australia, and here I'm actually meaning non-government organisations. I'm not talking about sort of social movements or grassroots movements, but non-government organisations, charity type organisations. What are the strategies and tactics that they are using, either directly against the ultra-processed foods and the alcohol industry in Australia, or through government to kind of force government to move, to do something to regulate the behaviours and practices of those two industries? And an analysis that we did, first of all, looking at the literature, really identified a whole load of potential strategies that are more or less effective depending on how you sequence them, whether you go inside or outside, whether you work with or whether you go out and use of name and shame or name and support. Whether you do, as I say, whether you do that directly with those commercial actors or with government. So the sequencing of these different strategies and tactics and the layering of them seems to be incredibly, incredibly important. And if you're interested, I'd highly recommend this paper that was led by my colleague, Belinda Townsend. And ultimately, there are strategies that work. And this, I'll finish with this really just to highlight the weapons of the structurally weak, as I've called it. The strategic use of evidence. So the weapons of the structurally weak are the civil society, the health actors. In government, health doesn't have the strongest voice always. So how do we operate when we've got these other dominant interests and institutional rules? Well, strategic use of evidence, framing that compellingly. So we saw the sugar sweetened beverage taxes that got up in Mexico. Part of what made that happen was big sugar is killing our children. That was a very compelling frame by civil society groups. The forum shopping is if you don't get uptake in one organisation or group, you move it to another organisation. So we've seen that where using the trade unions have advanced an agenda where it wasn't getting any movement in the Department of Health. And then when it became a workers' rights or a labour rights issue, then it got some. So you forum, you shop it around. internal and external policy processes, I think, are really important. And then that glib thing, but the so important thing of the coalition building and the building of the unusual with the unusual bedfellows. If it's all the bleeding public health hearts, then it doesn't get much cut through. But when you're there with the unions, or when it's about workers, or when it's about other unusual bedfellows, really, really important. And the only other point I want to make is the elite support and the elite division. We saw an analysis in the US of why the US government moved, the Biden government moved really strongly, was the utilities sector for fossil fuels. I'm talking about here. The utilities sector came out very strongly against the fossil fuel industries. And so there was a division in the energy sector, and the Biden administration was able to make use of that division. So they used the support from the utilities sector to try and drive through more progressive policy. So strategic use of those divisions. So I hope that's given you some things that are useful in your work. Fundamentally, addressing that system that's driving these harmful ways of production, of hyper-consumerism, but with a focus on the systems that are driving. And I do believe it's not a one, there's certainly no silver bullet to any of this. It's a combination of all of those things that I was pointing to in terms of what might contemporary capitalism require, with commerce as a part of that. So I'll stop sharing now, and hopefully we'll get time to discuss.
Thank you so much, Sharon. That was absolutely fantastic. I think I said in my introductory comments that this was a complex area, and it certainly is, but I think you've taken us through in the last 40 minutes a really cogent kind of dissection of the problem and the kind of issues that we face, and obviously given us a bit of hope about how we can start to address this system. So and I'm seeing we're getting lots of clapping emojis, so you're getting a good reaction there. I'm not sure how much I'd like to summarize this, but I guess the things that struck me in terms of the first half of your talk about some of the kind of the the problems and the issues and how that manifests itself was, but I thought that the graph showing the country inequalities in greenhouse gas emissions was very powerful. And I think the kind of the diagnosis that we're not really, or we haven't been addressing the structural determinants is something that a lot of people would recognize. And I guess a lot of it wasn't surprising, but the discrediting of science, the greenwashing, the political lobbying, the political activities is something that I think everyone recognizes. The activities of BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, the financialization of global economies, I think we all recognize to kind of some extent. So I mean, I think that's the kind of, again, just reflecting on a lot of the kind of the complexity that you've brought to this, but also bringing it within a kind of an understandable kind of framework of where the problems lie and also where we can start to address it. So addressing it at a state level, a market level, and within civil society, I think it's really important. So I'm sure we'll get into discussions of all of that in the next half an hour. I guess what I'm going to do now is ask for reflections from our two panelists, and before I do so, I know a lot of people are starting to use the Q&A. Just like you to kind of, anyone in the audience, to kind of use the Q&A and maybe reflect on the what elements of the consumptogenic environment that Sharon's brought out resonate most with you and the work that you're doing, and some questions to maybe think about how are we trying to address the commercial determinants of health in Scotland, and again drawing on people's individual kind of work. So I'm going to introduce the panel and then ask them for their reflections. So I'm going to start firstly with Laura. And Laura and Garth, could you, yes, you're up there, great. So Laura has been Deputy Chief Executive of Alcohol Focus Scotland since 2017, has been part of a senior management team at this influential public health advocacy organisation for over 10 years. During that time, she's successfully campaigned for the introduction of minimum unit pricing for alcohol and has driven changes to alcohol licensing within Scotland, and has worked with individuals and communities affected by alcohol harm to ensure that their voices are heard in national policy discussions. From 2021, Laura spent 18 months in the secondment to the Spectrum Research Consortium as a knowledge broker for Scotland. She was connecting academic research on commercial determinants of health with policy development across alcohol, tobacco, and unhealthy foods. I'll quickly introduce Garth as just now as well. So Garth's a consultant in Public Health Scotland and has worked in the public health area for about 20 years. He works in tobacco control, vaping and gambling. He's a co-investigator in the Spectrum Consortium, which we've heard about earlier. And I should probably explain that this is a multi-university, multi-agency research consortium focusing on the commercial determinants of health and health inequalities. Garth's also a member of the NIHR Public Prioritisation Committee, and he was, until recently, a member of the board of ASH Scotland. So thank you to you both for attending, and if I could pass over to Laura to you first for your reflections.
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks so much, Sharon. That was a brilliant, kind of fascinating presentation, and I think from my perspective, the most sort of impactful bit of your presentation is just how much it resonates with our experience in Scotland in alcohol policy right now. There's a lot going on in alcohol harm reduction policy in Scotland just now, and it feels like we're at a kind of watershed moment, I think, for public health policy in Scotland. We've had a couple of events happen over the last year or so that have created this kind of political opportunity for a big power play that we're seeing playing out, where we've got alcohol industry deploying all of those tactics that you were outlining, funding think tanks to discredit the public health evidence, undertaking big reputational corporate social responsibility campaigns, huge amounts of lobbying going on. And we're just in a kind of climate, I think, where some of the public health gains that we've made in Scotland over the last 10 years or so are really at risk of being rolled back. And I think organisations like mine and Public Health Scotland and civil society organisations in this space in Scotland at the moment are really at the point of trying to work out how to get more power.
Oh, I think Laura has been. Oh, you're back. Sorry.
I'm back. Sorry, I think I've got internet issues this morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, yes, that's fine.
So just to kind of give you an example of what's happening in Scotland just now, we've enjoyed, I think, a period of about a decade of pretty staunch public health prioritisation from our government. They have introduced these big kind of system interventions that you're talking about. We have an alcohol strategy that includes a number of big system intervention ambitions. And the one that has been implemented and has had a big positive effect on alcohol is minimum unit pricing, which has been in place for 5 years. And we just had Public Health Scotland publish the evidence of the effectiveness of minimum unit pricing last year, and it has shown that it has achieved its aim of reducing consumption and reducing alcohol harm. So that's a big positive. The policy has been proven to be effective, but it feels now that the industry has spent the time while this policy has been being evaluated, organising itself for the next phase and to counter the next phase. I think, you know, there's general consensus that the alcohol industry was a bit caught off guard by minimum unit pricing and how much political support came behind minimum unit pricing. And having been around through that experience over the last 20 years, what we're seeing from the industry now is a much more coordinated, multi-layered, hugely invested response. And this year, the Parliament has to vote on whether we keep minimum unit pricing in place and whether we increase the price per unit that it's set at. So we're seeing a huge amount of political lobbying, press activity, funding of think tanks to produce evidence to counter the public health evidence, criticism of Public Health Scotland's really robust evaluation of minimum unit pricing, and so on and so on. And then we also saw the government consult on introducing alcohol marketing restrictions. So that was going to be the next step in this kind of structural intervention approach. And that has been met with an absolutely huge negative response from the industry. But we've seen some really clever tactics being deployed where they're foregrounding small independent businesses this time around, whereas it was the big global alcohol companies who really opposed minimum unit pricing and took the government to court. You can see there's this organised approach of it's Scotland's wee whisky producers that are fronting a lot of the public campaigning on the part of the alcohol industry. And we have a new First Minister in place, and I think in a move that none of us really anticipated, the leadership contest between the people who were going to take over from our previous First Minister ended up largely being defined by an argument around the alcohol marketing restriction proposals and the deposit return scheme. So bringing the kind of environmental and health policy ambitions of the government together, and it really divided the leaders, or the people who were contesting the leadership contest. And then the new First Minister has been on a kind of charm offensive with business to try and present a business-friendly face of his government. And they're walking this really fine line between doing that while also trying to keep the public health policy and legacy of the government to date going. But it really feels like we're taking a big step back and opening up opportunities for industry to get into policy discussions in a way that they really haven't been able to be involved in for the last 10 years or so. So I guess probably my one question for you is whether we are seeing examples from any other countries where they are moving positively towards that more contemporary capitalism model. There's talk in Scotland of creating a well-being economy, but there's also the creation of a new deal for business. And it feels like the well-being economy is already being captured by business interests, and how the well-being economy is being defined feels like it's being more defined at the moment by business interests than by public health and interests, and the definition of well-being, I think, is questionable. So if there's examples from elsewhere of where they're managing to do that, that would be really helpful to hear.
Thanks, Laura. That's a really interesting point you make just about how the alcohol industry is changing their tactics, I think. Sharon, do you want to come back on Sharon's question just now? Or well,
so I was hoping Gareth was going to have the answer to that. No, do you mind? Let me have a little think about it, because I do. There's I've got a sort of a reflection from Australia, but let me come back to it. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Give you a bit of time. So Gareth, it's over to you, and please give us your reflections and where you think this is relevant to Public Health Scotland's work, for example.
Great, thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Sharon. As Laura said, I thought it was a fantastic session. I think it really brings it to light. Sometimes reading the articles can, be complex, and so I think having these sorts of presentations is so valuable. So thank you to everyone at GCPH as well and for it. I thought it was really excellent. I think really probably just a couple of short reflections from me. And then I'll just say a little bit about a couple of things we're doing, which might be interesting to hear your thoughts on. And then I was just going to ask at the end what you've said there, in terms of what can Scotland learn from what's happened in Australia and things that we might prioritise or focus on around this area, because it is so vast. So yeah, I mean, I really love the bit at the start where you talked about this, the fact that climate change and social determinants and commercial determinants are woven together. And I think quite often I find that to be quite rare. People talk about them as separate things, whereas I absolutely agree that they are really, interwoven, probably with the social determinants as the sort of foundation, then the commercial determinants then are embedded on top of it. But I think you can see that in our communities. So, your talks maybe made me think about, so if you think about gambling, your example there, so betting shops. So betting shops are located really enormously in our most deprived communities. And the thing that you maybe think about is that that's not a mistake. That's a business decision. So it's a business decision to target those communities. People have sat down and decided where to invest money, hard money, into those properties. And it's similar online in terms of gambling adverts are targeted very carefully at who they want to gamble. So if you watch a gambling advert on TV and you think it's rubbish, it's because it's not designed for you. It's not pointing at you. It's a dog whistle that you can't hear, really. So I think, it really struck me. I really like the way that you talked about that. And then also just the industry tactics, and just the aim for corporations is to follow the money, at any cost. And I think that was really powerful for me. And it made me think about Laura's point, producing high strength, low cost alcohol to sell at high volumes is a business decision. Again, it's not a mistake. And also, yeah, someone has to drink that at high volume because you need to sell to high volume. So the two things come together. And it's the same with vapes, e-cigarettes. They're not colourful with childish names, and they don't use youthful models by mistake. This is intent, I think, and that really came through in the presentation. So thank you. And just the tactics of using fear and confusion, I think was really powerful as well. One of the things I've observed is this, as you've said, twisting the scientific approach almost against sort of what we want to in public health. So saying, well, nothing can be done until everything is known. And actually, that's really deeply unhelpful and not true, because often we have to take action to protect people. And I think that came out from the talk too as well. So yeah, I just really excellent. And I think there's a lot for me to think about. And the links in the chat were great. I've clicked on all of them to read, I think later, check that I have read them. So in terms of what we're doing, it's a slightly different element to Laura's. Before I ask, just thinking about what else we can do in Scotland. So I guess it's the importance of the regulatory frameworks element that you had in your slide, which really is one of the bits we're focusing on. For me, corporate interests are like vampires. They only come out at night. They can't stand the light of transparency. They grow in the dark. So we want a framework to shine a light on interests. So we want a framework. You're doing two things, really. One is to develop a framework for managing conflicts of interest with colleagues from the Spectrum Consortium, academics, and then we want to engage with the wider sort of partners as well when we get to that point. But it's to really try and have transparency at the foundation of it, so that government policy is really transparently produced and protected from industry influence and NHS work as well. So that's one of the framework, managing the framework of conflicts of interest. And then another bit is Article 5.3 of the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control, which is the sort of foundation stone of industry, protecting from the tobacco industry. So we're looking to implement that just sort of internally in PHS, as we've got a legal obligation to do that. But I think that for me, I always find Article 5.3 to be the foundation a lot of what we do. But the thing, like your talk, we haven't considered, things like the financial institutions. I don't think we've got a work stream around that. I don't know what we would do around that, but it was really clear that that's an enormous driver. So I suppose then, just coming back to the question I was thinking about, is there some of the things we're doing? Is there anything that you think is missing there? Is there anything which you've done or know of other countries that have done that we might consider? Because I think we'd be really open to that, because I think it's an enormously important area.
Thanks very, very much, Garth. And again, a lot of resonance from what you're doing with what Sharon's been talking about in this talk. And I think we've kind of had the same kind of question that from Garth that Laura raised about, are there countries that we can kind of learn from who are kind of making progress? And I guess if I could frame that as well as, what kind of country, a small country with a devolved government within a larger United Kingdom structure like Scotland do amongst these big beasts that are possibly more powerful than individual governments. They probably are. So I was just wondering if you've gathered your thoughts.
Well, yeah. Well, thank you both. Like really, really interesting, really helpful reflections. I'm really, really sad to hear about what's happening with the, just your remarks, Laura, for the alcohol industry. I suppose I would sort of preface anything that I'm about to say with the thing of I certainly don't see any country doing everything, nor doing everything well. But I think for me, the hope is that this kind of the understanding of there's this spectrum, or there's all of those practices that we've sort of spoken about. And so we see that framework of those practices, and then recognizing that some places around the world are intervening, some governments are intervening more or less effectively, but they're intervening not on all of them, but on some of them. And so there are examples of really, really strong limits on advertising. I don't know about alcohol, but on some other harmful commodities. So there's lessons there, and there's more analysis being done to understand what were the conditions that enabled that to happen. And to me, that's the most interesting question. It's what was it that enabled that to happen? Because then there's the lesson for how that might happen in other places, understanding the contextual nuances, of course. So there are examples of different approaches to whether it's about shining a light on the discrediting of science by some of the industries. There's examples of successful litigation of companies, particularly fossil fuel companies, for harms caused to children because of climate change. There's successful examples of that around the world, in the Netherlands, for example. There's success examples in the finance space. So there's no success at all of taking on those big three that I described. But there are things happening with the divestment campaigns. The success needs to be much bigger, but there's some success. Share Action in the UK works very closely with ethical investors, and they are just in the process of developing how do you build health into a decision-making frame, because that's what the investors are asking for. When the discussion we're having with them is, well, how do we know how to invest? How do we know what's good for health? Like, do we do this or not? So Share Action in the UK are working through what a decision-making framework would be. That's I think, going to be a really useful tool, because certainly when you see the generational shift happening in the investors, and it is happening once all the more conservative elites in the investment world disappear, these more ethical investors will have a much greater voice. So I think that's really important. And so, as I say, with Share Action, there's something happening there. Some of the reforms, and so in Australia, just to mention, some of the reforms that are happening around disclosure of corporate lobbying funding is really good. It's by no means perfect, but there's a real push for that to become mandatory in a way, and with a level of detail that we used to have that got clawed back, and then there's now a real push for that, and it's likely that that will happen. And then, of course, that disclosure of corporate donations, political donations, and lobbying, and the opening of ministers' diaries. I don't know if you have that in Scotland, where you see who has been coming in to meet with the minister and the staffers and what the meeting was about. There's been some lovely analysis done here to do with food policy development in Australia. And I mean, it's horrific, but that was a really useful accountability tool that was being used. So I do see hope by drawing on examples. There's no one place doing all of that, but the devolved powers thing, I certainly don't know about that. All I know is I live in a federated society in Australia, and it's a nightmare. But some of the states in Australia, the states and territories, so some of the levers sit at the Commonwealth level and some sit at the state and territory level. And there's been amazing restrictions on advertising around alcohol and ultra-processed foods done at the state and territory level, which has been just outstanding. But at the Commonwealth level, they just won't touch it. And then my final remark around the well-being economy and how to keep the well-being economy moving in the sort of the intended direction that it was sort of set up for. I suppose that really is just a reflection on how social movements in the past were very important for keeping governments to account when they were trying to move away from what they either made a commitment towards. I mean, I'm thinking here around particularly female rights. I can't think of the proper term, but female rights. Particularly in the US at the time, when the US government was trying to roll back on that policy norm around female emancipation and so forth. And it was the social movements that were very coordinated. Now, you might say that was a different sort of point in history, but I suppose it's finding the similarity of the narrative that worked then that might work now, because I think you're absolutely right. I see that myself with the well-being economy discourse. It's been captured by businesses, as is equity. The whole equity language has been captured by business. And there, so civil society just has to be so loud, just really so loud. And the alternative, public journalism, that has emerged in Australia really quite powerfully. We need more of it, but because our press, like in the UK, our press is the Murdoch press. It's just captured by the Murdoch press, so it just promulgates a particular message. And so the public journalism and for-purpose journalism, we're using that, or civil society groups are using that to really bring the equity, the environmental, and the well-being discussions much more set. And so public concern and demand for it is still really high. And that to me is a really good sign if you've got public demand still for these sorts of issues. So sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded way of not having a concrete answer to it, but it's the kind of using the pieces from around the world.
Yeah, no, that's really, really helpful, Sharon. And I guess none of us expected every country to have all the answers, but there's there's lots of different approaches there. And I think your last point about public journalism is really interesting. There's the Ferret now in Scotland, which does that kind of independent type of journalism in Scotland. So we have about 5 or so minutes left, and I've got lots of questions in the chat. So I'm going to just take you through a few of them and just get if you can kind of respond. So I'll take you through a couple first. Do you think it should be an international environmental crime to buy a patent on an emission solution and simply to suppress the benefit? And a second question here, which is it's really about asking about the importance placed on decreasing the availability of physical resources, petrol, copper, etc., in terms of your work, and as well as the consideration of all government plans about using green energy and biofuels versus the overall physical resources that we've got. So I think that second one was more about what's the balance of importance there between decreasing the availability of these resources as well as having, the green energy policies. So, and I'll maybe just stop there and let you kind of respond to those two.
Well, I think the question of an international environmental crime, that sort of speaks partly to the success that we're seeing through the climate litigation cases, which it's not about it being an environmental crime, but it's about a crime to the rights of current and future generations, is how that argument has gone. So I certainly think there's merit in the assessment of the legal tools that could be drawn upon for exactly this question. I think morally and ethically, of course, it's an international environmental crime. It's just whether we've got the legal instruments that are set up for the purpose of making that argument. That would be something to examine. The question of the availability of these resources and the amount of availability of these resources versus a kind of a policy direction around clean energy and biofuels speaks to that sort of early point that I made of we can adapt, we can try to extract emissions and or about just sort of preventing the emissions or the environmental degradation in the first instance.
Yeah.
And if we prevent the environmental degradation in the first instance, that means we've got to we've got to grapple with that really hard question of, does that mean a reduction in availability? And that gets us into the global equity question of historical users and current users for development purposes, which is, that's the loss and damage discussion. Frankly, I think the green energy and the biofuels discussion is a distraction to the very hard question of how we actually stop it in the first instance.
Yeah.
And I say that because we've got such a short time period to actually to respond really, really seriously. If we had a longer time frame, then yes, these are all incremental steps to addressing this problem, but we've got such a short time frame to do something really significant. So that would be my response to that. But of course, that's not politically acceptable.
Okay, no, thank you. Well, I've got a few other questions, and Laura and Garth, please come in as well if you'd like to respond. So I've got one here. Do you feel that there is a role for educators to raise awareness of the hugely damaging impacts of the current dominant ideologies? And can they also offer more changes to learn about alternative ideologies such as degrowth and the commons? So that's a kind of a question about education, I guess. And another related education question or research question is whether researchers working in commercial determinants of health need to try and speak and work with those working in environmental and climate politics, and does advancing planetary health agenda require a more coordinated approach across research fields? So that's really for anyone if you want to come in, but over to you, Sharon, if you want.
I'm happy to do the research fields ones, but just so that I'm not doing all the talking, Laura or Gareth, do you want to come? But I'll come in on the research fields question.
On the education one, I think I was really interested, Sharon, in what you were saying about the identifying the alternative public journalism, because I think that is something we're really up against, particularly in relation to marketing restrictions, because there's so much advertising of these unhealthy commodities takes place in our dominant media sources. And really interestingly, we just saw the consultation on the marketing restrictions. We saw the responses published, and there was a huge amount of responses to the marketing consultation from press groups, media, businesses, and I've never really seen that before in response to a public health consultation. So I guess I'm thinking about education in its widest sense, just kind of communicating with the public. I definitely think there is something to be said for raising the kind of critical awareness of some of the structures and tactics that you've been describing, Sharon. I think the kind of dominant narrative when it comes to public health in communications and in the media and in the information that the public have access to is still on that very individualistic level. It's teaching people how to control their consumption of unhealthy products. And it is really difficult to find journalists at the moment who are willing to sort of take on that bigger structural discussion. And I think we do need a lot more of that. There have been some really nice examples of education with young people. So the Tobacco Truths project, which was much more about educating young people on the tactics of the tobacco industry rather than teaching them about the health harms of smoking. We've done a couple of pilots replicating that in Alcohol Truths, and young people in particular get really fired up when they feel like they're being manipulated and targeted by these big, powerful companies. So I think education, if it was more along those lines about empowering that kind of social movement, would be really helpful. And I really think there is a lack of common understanding about these big, powerful networks that are behind a lot of the hyper-consumerism. I think the public would be really engaged in that if we could get that out there more.
Yeah, I agree. Just to chip in, I think what we know from other areas is that we need a combination of approaches as well. So as Laura said, education, but it needs to be framed correctly. But I think also, it's tackling these other drivers, price, availability, some of these fundamental commercial drivers that the industry very intentionally use, going back to the high strength, low cost alcohol, not being a mistake, being an actual plan. So I think we need to tackle, a number of these issues together. And I think education is part of that picture. But it's not going to be sufficient on its own. And I think there is a risk, as Laura said, of drifting towards it being people's fault, or for drinking high strength, low cost alcohol, rather than, well, this is actually being produced and promoted and placed very carefully in communities. And then, what else is going to happen other than it be consumed? So I think that without taking that step back and having that sort of combination of approaches that work together like a bit of a jigsaw to try and address the issue would be my kind of view on it as well. But I think that there is a part for it too.
Great, thanks, Garth.
I agree completely. Yeah.
So Sharon, I don't know if you've had a chance to think about that last question about the kind of research element, and after you've responded, we'll kind of maybe draw things to a close.
Sure, and so all I would say about the research side of things is, yes, like there should be much more engagement across different fields of research, whether that needs to be in a coordinated way. I think we spend an awful lot of time trying to coordinate it, but really just a widening the toolkit within public health research to recognize we've got to understand politics, we've got to understand decision-making processes. It might not be sexy or exciting, but it shapes the world. We've got to understand the conditions that make change happen for good or for bad. And that doesn't sit in the public health discipline comfortably. So yes, absolutely into the world of politics, of political science, of sociology, of philosophy. It's all of the above. And so my final remark as a researcher is, and as a social health researcher, we have to stop giving primacy to epidemiology. And my epidemiology colleagues, if you're on the line, I'm sorry, I love you, but you will not be the answer. That research is not the answer to these sorts of problems. It's part of it, in the same way Garth was just talking about the jigsaw of solutions. The research has to be a jigsaw of types of fit for purpose evidence. So yes, it's got to be broad. I've just alienated myself from the public health research community.
No, I think that's a really useful insight, actually, and a great way to finish the kind of seminar. I was going to reflect on your talk, but I'm running out of time, and we're at 11 o'clock. So I really just wanted to welcome people in the audience's feedback and thoughts on this seminar. So we'd be very grateful if you'd complete a quick evaluation. I think there's a link going on to the chat, and that evaluation form will also be emailed to people. So thanks to everyone who attended and for your questions, and thanks in particular to our panel members, Laura and Garth. Thanks, that's been great. And obviously to yourself, Sharon, for such a fantastic and detailed and interesting talk. And so what else do I need to say? So it's just to remind people that there'll be a recording of today's webinar will be available in the next few weeks, and the link will be emailed to everyone, and we'd encourage people to share that with your networks and your colleagues. Our next seminar in the series is still being arranged, so nothing to report there, but just keep an eye out for the GCPH email invites if you're on our network, and there'll be more details about that to come. So that's it. Thanks again to you all for attending, and thanks for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Lovely to talk with you.
Thank you, Sharon.